This is ChangeMakers with Katie Goar, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Today's changemaker is Beth Silverman, the co-founder and executive director of Lotus Campaign, a nonprofit that is rethinking how the private sector can solve homelessness. Beth has worked across multiple sectors, from real estate to public policy and urban planning. And today she's building a model that brings landlords, developers, and social services together. So with that, Beth, thank you for joining us on ChangeMakers.
Great to be here, Katie. Thanks so much for having me.
I love that we have you on the podcast. There is so much to talk to you about what you're doing, this model that you bring, and just how homelessness is being able to be re-envisioned and revamped and to bring some solutions to the table. It's a topic that's near and dear to me. I've shared a little bit about my backstory and housing insecurity. So with that, I feel like there's some divine overlaps and what we're about to talk about.
Well, I'm excited to dig in.
So why don't you tell us first, maybe go back to the beginning, and when did this, life career start evolving for you, and how was it that it was something that you actually wanted to be involved in and you wanted to start to tackle?
It's a great question. Like many of us, my professional path has been nonlinear. I always knew that I cared about the intersection of community, people, and economics, and I studied city planning, but found myself always working on the real estate and policy side of things. And I've spent the bulk of my career in the public, private, and nonprofit sector, really to understand sort of how every piece of the puzzle works. And a theme, I think as you get further along in your career, you can look back and see the themes and the threads that you couldn't see while you're actually in that role or, 10 years earlier. But housing has always been a key part of the work I've done, whether it was how to get developers to do mixed income housing and open space during the Great Recession when no one was lending from the banks, or how to bridge gaps when the city was the only person that had sort of financial tools. And spent a lot of time when I was at the Urban Land Institute working with communities across the country and internationally, different sort of urban, rural, suburban, different political spectrums and ideologies about how to think about complicated land use and real estate issues. And something that started coming up during that period of time is every community thought they were the only ones with the housing affordability and increasingly homelessness issues. So that was a first aha moment, like, seems like, we're struggling a lot in this country, all over the country, with workforce housing and just struggling with rising levels of homelessness. And housing, to me, and I think probably most of your listeners, it is the key to everything, right? And so sort of starting to have that all meld was the basis of Lotus, thinking through, wow, we spend so much time and energy thinking about these issues, but it seems like the private real estate sector and investment communities aren't often at the brainstorming table at the beginning. How come, right? And so some of those questions, starting to think about that, became the basis of what is now Lotus Campaign. But I also think, on a personal note, I think we all have people in our life, whether it's friends, family, maybe it's been ourselves, where one twist of the dial and we're in a super vulnerable position. And I think that the key difference, and I think about this with my family when my great-grandparents immigrated here, they had a network of support to catch them when they were new, didn't have jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And if that network of support is not there, then sort of someone's trajectory is much different. So at its core, Lotus really tries to create this network of support economically, from sort of access to real estate and then also with ongoing support and services.
So, why don't you start us off with Lotus? Give us a overview how you birthed it. I would love to hear how Lotus Campaign, how the name came to be, and start us from there.
Yeah, so Lotus, it's a simple idea. It's a radically simple idea. The whole idea is how do you bring together unexpected allies, so nonprofits in the social service sector who provide excellent case management, trauma-informed care to their clients, and the real estate sector, so the folks that control the assets, that invest in housing and have units. How do you bring them together to be partners in the solution of homelessness? So we started from there and we started thinking like classic sales technique. What are all the reasons someone would say no to renting to an individual or a family that has experienced homelessness or is coming from a spotty housing background? And two things: economic risk, perception risk. And we were like, well, we can definitely solve for the economic risk. So we use a series of financial and economic guarantees to take care of things like payment in lieu of security deposit, application fees, renter's insurance, if a voucher is being used, expedited inspection. So all these small costs that if you don't have a lot of resources to begin with are going to automatically X you out. And then if you add on spotty credit, may or may not have a job, spotty housing history, you're not going to qualify for a unit. So we thought, well, how could Lotus potentially be a guarantor there? And then on the perception side, we canvassed landlords, owner operators, investors from across the country, and the number one thing was, hey, I want to be part of a solution. I can't jeopardize the economics of my business, and I can't put that burden on my property management staff. They're not caseworkers. What happens if something goes wrong? And that's where partnering with really high capacity social service organizations comes in, because they are already doing this incredible work and they just don't have access to market rate mixed income communities. So we thought, all right, well, let's focus on solving for these two things. We can definitely solve the economic piece. And if we partner with the right social service organizations, we can probably tackle that perception piece. And then a huge part of Lotus's model is really partnering with properties in what we call neighborhoods of opportunity. So that's just a super fancy jargon way of saying, mixed income, close to transit, near grocery stores, proximity to major employers, all the things that intense economic data says makes the difference in someone's economic mobility. And we're really serving individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness, but also those that are at risk. A big thing is prevention, and a lot of work we do too is eviction prevention. It really started from who's missing from the table. What happens if we start asking the question, what if? And how about we deploy existing resources in a different way and break down silos between two sectors that are the absolute key to making a dent in homelessness?
When you hear verbs that are adjectives, really, when you hear it, you're hearing fragmented, you're hearing complicated, you're hearing hindrances, obstacles. But what the model that you guys have created is you're trying to reduce all of those friction points and create a way by which some of those gaps can be overcome. And it's unique because um, you know it's been so complicated. It's prevented people from coming into the space to solve it. But it sounds like you guys are just barging through that same space with your model. Um, what's been some of the reactions as you're coming to landlords and developers and you're bringing everybody to that table? What have you been confronted with?
I would actually say getting the real estate sector involved has not been the hardest part. I think, like every sector, there are There are mission folks that want to opt in. And then there are some that it's a little bit of a harder sell. But now that we have 7 years under our belt, we're in 2 cities, we have lots of data, it's a much easier pitch. And also we've got, a regional property manager. Your regional property manager can, speak to and learn about their experience. I think, you know, so many members of the real estate sector have just had unfortunate experiences partnering with nonprofits, and that sticks with them. So I think helping to distinguish, hey, the biggest part of our model is the strength of ongoing support and services. And if something goes wrong, we're there every step of the way. Because we also do a lot of, if someone is not going to work out or there's an issue with rent for some reason, we step in and make sure that we're, covering those gaps. Yeah, but I would say the I think a question we got a lot in the beginning was, well, if it was this simple, why isn't anyone doing this? Right. So I love that one. And then the greatest comment when we were in Charlotte is like, that will never work. And then now that we're in 2 cities, oh, that only works in North Carolina. And we're working on expansion. So, while sort of each market is different and you need to have high touch local relationships, what we're doing is we're just taking an economic, human, and real estate lens to something that is both a social, real estate, and economic issue, right? So we're trying to bring all those lenses and tools into the solution.
When I hear the word lotus, I think of the Eastern analogy about it being something about a phoenix, a flower that blooms in dark and murky water. It's almost like associated with rebirth and awakening and, all of those.
Yeah.
What about the name? Is that part, how did you come up with the name? What does the name mean? Is there an analogy that, um, to that particular flower? Tell us all about that.
Well, for any of your listeners that are entrepreneurs, figuring out what to call your thing is really hard. And when you're trying to tackle something like homelessness, which is heavy and no one wants to touch it, no one wants to get near it, you're like, what are we going to call this thing? And I mean, we must have gone through so many sort of ideas. And then one of my co-founders, who's now our chairman of the board, was like, what about lotus? The lotus flower submerges each night into pond mud. That seems like an analogy to homelessness. And the next morning blossoms into a beautiful flower. And that's what we're trying to do, is try
Mhm.
to sort of put resources to get someone back on their feet. So it is totally what you thought it was. It's the lotus flower, which is a symbol across so many cultures and spiritual traditions of rebirth and renewal. And we just thought, even though, people may or may not get it, we thought it was a great metaphor for what we're trying to do.
Great. I had hoped that's what it was, but I wanted to hear because there's even like a whole bunch of studies about how the lotus flower is supposed to be divine because of how it's able to bloom from darkness. So great pick of a name. So good job to your board member who came up with that. You mentioned that you're in Charlotte. You mentioned that you're expanding. Before we go through your expansion specifics there, but tell us, like, what is the need in Charlotte, and what are you seeing as far as the mismatch to need to supply, or however you measure those metrics.
Yeah, so Charlotte is no different than a lot of cities that have affluence, right? It's experienced tremendous growth, both in population, jobs, and migration from outside of the state. And what happens when you don't have enough housing? Folks that are the most vulnerable with the fewest resources don't have as much choice. And so, the current stats I feel like change all the time, anywhere from 35,000 to 50,000 units undersupplied, which is a helpful stat. But when you start breaking that down to cost burden and what someone maybe, making under 30% of area median income can afford, and how many available units there might be that are affordable, you really see how dire the issues are. So, Charlotte is an incredible city that I would say is really, really taking a courageous look at its housing affordability and homelessness challenges. But it is a city, like many cities across the country, that's experienced tremendous growth. Rising levels of homelessness usually follow where there is economic growth and affluence in a city.
And then about Charlotte, as far as when you have you always been there? You started there. What where do you want to go from here? Give us some parameters.
So we started in Charlotte, and we started before we launched. We got to beta test with a really great partner of ours who let me and my harebrained idea test this idea with a couple units, see how it would work, and really has just grown from there. About 2.5 years ago, we expanded to Raleigh, North Carolina, which is another is the capital of the state, and really learned a lot from that growth. Total replicable model, things that need to be tailored to that specific community. Not all social service partners exist in every single community, right? And learning sort of what are the challenges in this community versus what Charlotte has. And what's cool though is in Raleigh, because we got to build on all the lessons learned in Charlotte, we've had the same amount of impact, but in half the time. And that comes obviously from sweat equity that happened when we first started, and refining things along the way. And then, Lotus was always built to be replicable and scalable. So we'd like to be in a couple more cities outside of North Carolina, and where we can't go, teach others how to do it. And unfortunately, homelessness continues to increase each year. And as sort of economic inequities continue to rise, there's a direct correlation with homelessness as well. So we want to be able to share what we're doing where we can't go.
Hmm. So do you see yourselves expanding then out of North Carolina?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've built the framework though, and there's always a splice of, like you mentioned, what is the social service network like? What are the landlords? What's the real estate like? But once
Totally.
you've built the framework and you've dialed in on how to make this happen, I think you've started to solve some of the secret ingredients, if you will, of how this can work. And we've talked to a couple of other people on this podcast, which is one of the reasons we have this is because we don't want to solve some of these problems in isolation and gatekeep them. We want to share them and show how it can be replicated. You've even actually been on another podcast guest of ours, Atticus LeBlanc, on with Pad Split,
Yeah, yeah,
which is like fabulous what he's doing there too.
totally. Yeah,
So it's
I'm like, he's in the tribe of like, we're trying to, what are those interim steps between
yeah.
emergency solutions and the long-term solutions that take a long time to get to? So
Yeah. And even what Atticus is doing is like he's really like stepping in to say, here's the problem, here's an alternate solution. It doesn't have to be this, overly complicated,
totally.
$750,000 subsidized unit to be built, right? And so like he is actually building up something quite as unique as what you're building here too. And quite frankly, it's going to take a little bit of everybody's solution to make a dent in this. One of the things you mentioned, even on the podcast with Atticus, was that you talked about how to go in and it's a phrase I like to say, but you do some of that myth busting. You mentioned the perception, you mentioned the riskiness, either from a business case study or from a social case study. But I want to let you comment on that because it's well worth repeating.
Yeah. Well, So here's what I'll say about this. I remember this discussion early on when we were building Lotus, and I must have said something like, if we are going to create a nonprofit working on these issues, we are not going to tell the same story that has been told for 50 years about how um, we solve, who the partners are, et cetera, et cetera. We got to do some different stuff and community education. And there's so many dangerous narratives out there about homelessness and the drivers and frankly the real estate industry. And I thought, okay, we have a platform where we can bring some curiosity and some creativity to teaching people and debunking some of these myths. So, a big myth that we hear a lot is one, homelessness is caused by bad choices. I
Mhm.
think any of us that have been alive know that the arbitrary nature of where you're born, the station in life you're born, that's not your choice. And and the data just is scary. I mean, most people are 1 or 2 paychecks away from a really big crisis, and sort of the level of folks that are right on the edge keeps increasing. So, what we've wanted to do is really debunk that. So, we did an event maybe 2 years ago where we did, a essentially like a bingo type game where you had a different card and it was sort of it told your income, it told sort of what happened to you that day. So there were a number of things like your car broke down, but if you get new tires, you can't afford this. And it really walked people through essentially just how easy it is to have one big shift in your life make it so that housing is unaffordable. The other myth we get a lot is, well, shouldn't the landlords are just greedy villains and why aren't they
Mhm.
giving units away
Right.
for free? And I love to debunk that myth as well because, I think we unfairly villainize the real estate industry when the reality is this is a business just like any other business. And if you give people an easy way to say yes to being part of the solution, they will. So I would
Mm.
say those are like the two big myths, but we do a lot of sort of sharing data in a creative way and telling a different story. And we're hoping that's sticking because I think the more everyday individuals are empowered with information, they can also help
Yeah.
combat some of these dangerous myths or share, like, hey, I heard about this solution. It's working here. Like, maybe this would be great for this community or things like that.
Well, I experienced homelessness when I was a child, and when you talk about the number of children who are currently in homelessness and through no choices of their own, and that's a whole nother statistic, and it's a whole nother reality. So it doesn't matter why they're there. It doesn't matter what choices their parents did or didn't make. The reality is they're there and they're homeless, and so we owe it to offer a hand up to people who need that moment. So I really appreciate what you're doing just personally and professionally. Um, where I'm also dying to ask you is something you mentioned earlier when you were working with landlords. I'm curious to how you talk with them to get them from a no to a yes. You were mentioning that, and I would sure love to hear what your pitch is because we're confronted with some of the same realities on our side as a compliance contractor too. So let me hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think how we approach people matters. So there is no should in Lotus's vocabulary. I think starting from a place of looking at someone like a potential business partner
Okay.
and bringing that, as your opening, like, I love what your company is doing. I would love to tell you more about this program, et cetera, et cetera. But I think honestly, really using um, real estate language. Like our staff is steeped both in real estate and also the human services side of things. So we code switch a lot. But I think sitting down with someone and really sharing that you understand their risk goes a long way to disarm someone's potential preconceived notions. But one thing we do in addition to all these upfront economic incentives, if an individual or family is not working out, say they're not paying their rent, they're not following the protocol of their case manager or whatever their program requirements might be from the nonprofit sponsoring them, we ask that our real estate partners give us 30 days to cure an issue. And if we cannot resolve it, we will cover loss of rent, damages. And if we cannot prevent an eviction, which we do a really good job of preventing those, we will cover court costs, legal fees, and someone will show up to testify on a landlord's behalf. And I will say that goes a long way because I don't know a single landlord that wants to go through an eviction process. It's painful. It is cumbersome and no one wants to end up there, right? But I think pointing out, "Hey, we get your risk. Really, we get it," right? That goes a long way. And then also I think now that we're we have slightly graduated from startup mode, we have a lot of data to share and we have a lot of sort of real life scenarios. Oh, this happened and in this community, this is how with our incredible social service partner, we resolved an issue. And I think sharing that versus why don't you want a partner or shouldn't you be doing this anyways, really changes the tone of the conversation. And then like any good salesperson, if someone says no, it just means your pitch wasn't good enough and you should modify it and try better the next time.
Yeah. Well, and you speaking into the point of being able to mitigate some of that risk on their behalf also shows your belief in what you're providing too. So, because you're stepping up there and bringing in that capital and minimizing that risk, and really showing that you're a good faith partner to those landlords, and that means something.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think like our model was built to mitigate risk and to open up and unlock units and opportunity. And we have enough data now to talk about, it's the combination of our financial incentives, risk mitigation, and mandatory ongoing support and services. And I think property managers and owner operators and landlords really get that because they've had some sort of experiences.
For real or perceived, or war stories from others. But yeah,
Yeah.
you mentioned some of the tools. You mentioned down payment or deposits. You've mentioned some damages or some other things. Is there a component to credit improve scores? Just kind of walk us through some of those tools that you are actually able to bundle for people.
Yeah, so I think there are 3 buckets. There's like upfront, what is going to open up access and opportunity for someone getting into housing. So those are pretty basic. Renter's insurance, application fee, paying for expedited inspections if a voucher is being used, so there's not a delay in approval of the unit. And then, we call it a payment in lieu of security deposit, but it's essentially the equivalent of that. And then there's sort of in the middle, right? If there are some issues, we can do some loss of rent and damages payments. And then sort of on the back end, we also, if someone's graduating, we'll cover their renter's insurance and their new unit that they qualified on their own. And we've also worked with individual properties on positive credit reporting. Once someone's in a unit paying rent, there are a ton of great programs. It's depends on the property and what they're choosing that will help folks get their credit up. So we like to really encourage that. Um, and then there is if we can't resolve an issue and something goes to someone being finding a better housing situation than the one they were in because it wasn't working out for certain reasons. Like I said before, we'll cover sort of the loss of rent and move out costs, etc.
Hmm. We've been talking a lot about the model and the nuances, but I can't but help ask you if you can share a success story, a case study, whatever you call them. I'd love to hear a life impact moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you 2. I'm gonna give you a partner story, and I'm gonna give you a resident story. One of our partners, when we were first starting out, had an investor who was super concerned that this Lotus campaign was going to be partnering with them and used some explicit language about what this might do to the properties he was an investor in. Real classic New Yorker, like, and what happens is a year in, we have all this great data about impact. We share with our landlords. We give them like an impact report card so they can share that with their investors, right? It's great stuff for annual reports. And the person that said, "What are you doing to these properties?" is now a corporate donor and one of our biggest champions and guerrilla marketers, and really sort of educates his investors on why they have to be investing in workforce housing and solutions to homelessness and things like that. And then my other favorite story is a resident in Charlotte who I've gotten to meet a couple of times because we've done some news stories together. But he came to us from a program called Hope Haven, which is a substance recovery program. Really great program that has a residential component, and people go through various steps of stability. And what they started to find is when our clients are graduating, they just can't afford market rent, even if they have jobs.
Yeah.
So Mario was our first resident that we housed through a partnership with Hope Haven. And Mario had at the time a part-time job as a truck driver, and he moved into a one-bedroom in one of our real estate partners' residential communities. Mario loves plants. I love plants. We are both terrible about keeping them alive, and we have bonded over that of what our strategies for sunlight and water and what's a good way to keep track of which plant needs water when. So fast forward to 3 years. Mario has graduated from Lotus Support and from the support of his nonprofit. He now has a full-time job, qualified for his on his own for a 2-bedroom apartment, got married last year, came to our annual fundraising gala with his new wife and gave a testimonial. And Mario is just a great example of someone that needed a little bit of time, a little bit of economic support, needed that network of support that he didn't have. And you know, Mario is thriving, which is like just so heartwarming to see. It's these really small things that make tremendous differences in people's lives.
I actually came across a story that you shared about someone named Dennis. He tells part of his story because he knows there's another Dennis out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No,
that
Dennis graduated from our program too. And Dennis is great. Yeah.
Mhm. But I mean that shows that, and I think that's part of the struggle of what we're trying to do is, you graduated Dennis and he moves to stability, but that now, there's another person that, is coming in because that cycle is difficult. Like you mentioned, people being, a paycheck or two or a life incident, a large medical surgery. I mean, like whatever
Totally.
the situation is, a car situation. I mean, there's just so much that, can
Can
happen
go
with
wrong. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
well, I really appreciate what you guys are doing. When's your next, annual fundraiser or a gala that you mentioned just a minute
It's
ago?
gonna be in September, and I will make sure to send you an invitation. We do one in Charlotte and one in Raleigh, and we try to make them interactive, so there's always, like, a sneaky learning component, but they're fun because, if you're gonna make people be in a room for 2 hours, you better make it engaging and fun.
Well, those, as a nonprofit, I'm sure those big, fundraisers, those, help add to, your mission as well. So, yes, share it with us. We will share with all of our contacts. In fact, we have a lot of staff who are in North Carolina, and so we would love to show up in mass. So make sure you share with us. Again, I'm talking with Beth Silverman, the co-founder and executive director of the Lotus Campaign. Beth, you and your team are doing an amazing job. So thank you very much for sharing what you guys are doing and making an impact.
Yeah, thank you so much for the awesome conversation and sharing some of your story.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Goar. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.